Hey, I want to show you something really cool. Well, I think it's pretty cool anyway. These are all the blocks that we've been making so far in our free Quilt as you go along. Heart block, let's do it, but quilt as you go. If you're joining in with our free quilt as you go along, you'll need to make two. Welcome back to Pattern Poole TV, and if you're new here, welcome. I'm Poole, I'm a pattern designer and sewing tutor from Australia, and every week we post a video on how I make my quilt as you go quilts. We're almost at 25k subscribers, and I just want to say thank you all so much for your support. Every like and subscribe means a lot to us, and it means that we can keep sharing our tutorials for free on YouTube, making sewing accessible for everyone. Here is what you'll need to make one heart block. For the heart block, you'll need 7 fabrics. All of the strips for the heart are cut 1.5 inches wide. For the top of the heart, you'll need 2 pieces that are 4 inches long. Then 3 strips that are 7.5 inches long, and as the heart narrows, you'll need a 6.5, a 4.5, and a 2.5 inch length. From the background fabric, you'll need 4 1.5 inch squares and 1 4.5 inch square cut once on the diagonal. The outer strips are 2 inches wide. For the sides, you'll need 2 that are 7.5 inches long and another 2 that are cut 10.5 inches long. Here are the cutting instructions. Take a screenshot or head to our website. You'll also find them in our latest blog post. Just a reminder, I've designed these blocks to be joined together with the easy cover strip method on the back, just in the same way that I did with the diamond string quilt. You also have the option of joining your blocks together using the regular joining strip method. If you want to use the easy cover strip method on the back, the batting is cut 1/2 inch smaller all the way around the edge than the block. And if you want to use the regular joining strip method, just cut your batting to the same size as your backing fabric. All of the blocks for the free quilt as you go along start with a 10-inch backing square. When all of the blocks are complete, I'm going to just double check that they're the same size, and I'll only be trimming them slightly. You'll also need your 10-inch backing square and a piece of batting that is cut 9 inches, and it's positioned onto the wrong side of your backing square with a 1/2 inch gap all the way around the edge. I've already held my layers together with a light application of basting spray, but you can also use a few dabs of glue, just in the same way that I've shown in some of our other videos. This is another stitch and flip block, so to prepare for quilting, you're going to need to mark lines onto your batting and backing. Make sure you use a nice sharp marker. Don't use blunt chalk because this isn't going to give you accurate lines. So use a fabric marker of your choice. I'm using a sharp 4B lead pencil, but make sure that you don't press lines that are too dark because dark lines are going to show through on light fabrics. The first thing to do is to mark a line that is 1.25 inches away from the edge of the fabric on all 4 sides of the block. Now mark a vertical line in the center. Our block is 10 inches, so half of 10 inches is 5 inches. Mark the center horizontal line, so that's 5 inches away from the top edge of the block. And this time you don't need to mark it all the way along, we're just going to mark that to the 1.25 inch line. Now we need to mark a dot that is on this line that is 1 1/8 away from the side edge of the block, and do that on both sides, so 1 1/8, and we're also going to do that dot just at the bottom edge in the center, so 1 1/8 away from the bottom edge of the block. We now have 3 dots, and we're going to connect those dots. This is going to give us the bottom shape of the heart. Take the line from the fabric all the way across to the fabric on the other side, and do the same on the opposite side. Just lining up dot to dot and marking the line. Next, mark a line that is 3 3/4 inches down from the top edge. So this is the top, that's the bottom of the block, and there's 3 3/4. So that's coming from the top edge of the fabric. Now position this line onto a 1 inch marking on your cutting mat, And we're now going to continue marking lines that are spaced an inch apart. From this top line, we want to mark 4 lines and use the lines on your cutting mat. This is a nice way to make sure that these lines are going to be accurate. So connecting 1-inch lines from edge to edge of the block using the cutting mat as a guide. These lines are going to ensure that the strips are sewn on nice and straight. Now, if you didn't get all of that, there's a diagram in the blog post. Before we start stitching and flipping, we're going to make the top section of the heart. And to do this, we're going to take the small squares that were cut from the background fabric, and onto the wrong side of each of those squares, we're going to mark a diagonal line going from corner to corner. Now, position these pieces thinking that this is the top of our heart, and so we just want to round these pieces off. Position your diagonal lines in the same way that I have done here. So head to the sewing machine and sew on the marked diagonal lines with a neutral coloured thread, a size 70 needle and a stitch length of 2. Remember my little tip, and sew slightly outside the marked diagonal line. This is going to make sure that our corner folds back and meets this outer corner here. Press the squares over to make a triangle shape, making sure that your points line up in the corner. Do that to each square. Trim away the underneath fabric, cutting 1/4 inch away from the stitching line. And here are the 2 top pieces of the heart. Next thing is we want to put these right sides together, and we're going to sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I find it much easier to start sewing from the thicker end down to the less bulky end. Press this seam open. So position the top piece onto the block. Align the top edge of this piece with our first line across the top that is marked 1 1/4 inches away from the edge of the fabric. Align the center seam with our center vertical line, and you can hold this in place with a couple of dabs of glue or some pins. So now we're going to start stitching and flipping. Head to the machine and thread your machine up with a neutral coloured thread, something that's going to tie in with your backing fabric. You'll need a stitch length of 3, a size 80 quilting needle, and I'm just using my standard foot with my needle position moved over to the right to give me a distance of 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the needle. I've also set an automatic tie off, and if you don't have this function, just make sure that you do a little reverse stitch at the beginning and at the end of each row. Take your first strip and place it right sides together with the top of our heart, making sure that everything is nice and straight and level. Mark a dot that's 1/4 inch away from the beginning of your fabric and 1/4 inch away from the end. We're going to sew from dot to dot, making a little reverse stitch, or have your tie off set on your machine. Doing this will mean that we won't have our stitches crossing over on the back of our block and looking messy. So let's get started. Fold your top strip over to the right side. You'll know that your seam allowance is correct if the edge of your fabric meets this marked line here. Continue sewing the next 2 7.5 inch pieces on in the same way, starting them all level with this marked line here. You will notice as you sew that they will stretch along a little bit, but just making sure that you always start on this marked line, and that when you flip them over they meet these marked lines here. take the 6.5 inch piece, the 4.5 inch piece and the 2.5 inch piece. Fold each piece in half like this and mark a crease. Just make a little center crease there with your finger. Do the same to all of these pieces. Now stitch and flip these pieces on in the same way, but lining up the center crease with the center line. So here is our heart block coming together. I love how quick and easy this block is. Make sure that your bottom fabric hits the bottom marked line. Now to sew on the lower background triangles. Take both triangles and just position them onto the bottom edge of the heart, making sure that everything is aligned as it should be. Now take your first triangle and remember these lines that we marked here. Place your triangle right sides together with the raw edge aligned with that marked line, with that marked diagonal. Make sure that you have an even amount of the triangle extending past the edge of our heart fabric. And if you want to double check that that's in the right position, take your ruler and position it onto the block from corner to corner on a diagonal, and you'll see that the corner should be running along this diagonal line here. And if that's lining up, you'll know that your triangle is positioned in the right place. Mark your dots so that they're actually 1/4 inch away from this marked line on the edge. So we're going to go about there, and our bottom one will be so 1/4 inch away from the line there, which is going to go there. So sew your triangle on from dot to dot and sew your other triangle on in the same way. Be careful when sewing on your triangle because this edge is now on the bias and it can stretch, so just easing along as you sew. When you flip your triangle over, make sure that it meets this outer marked line, and if it does, you can just flip it back and trim away the excess fabric from the underneath. Don't forget that if you're using a light background fabric, make sure that you trim all of the darker fabrics away so that you don't have a shadow showing through on your light fabric. Carefully press the block before sewing on the outer side borders. Time to sew on the outer side borders, starting with the sides and then the top and the bottom. When sewing on the borders, align them with the 1.25 inch lines that we marked, and this is what's going to keep them nice and straight. Mark your dots and stitch and flip them on in the same way. Sew on your top and bottom borders, once again aligning the edge of the border with the 1.25 inch line. That's what's going to keep our border strips nice and straight. And no need to mark dots this time because you can sew from edge to edge of your backing fabric. press your block and trim your block back to the same size as the backing square. Before we join all of our blocks together, we're going to double check that they're the same size, and then we'll trim then if necessary. Very happy with my 2 heart blocks. Now all I have to do is work out where they're going to go on the quilt, but that's the fun of the mystery. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye!